Hello everyone and welcome once again to Yorkshire Gamer Podcast and episode 48 of this ongoing series, and today I am going to be talking with Peter Thompson from Pro Arte brushes. But before the interview, a little bit of housekeeping as usual, and I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in to the last episode, the David Manley one on naval wargaming, and it had quite a lot more viewers, listeners, should I say, than I thought, as naval wargaming normally sends anything I do down the pan in terms of viewer figures. So I hope perks your interest in a bit of naval wargaming, and if you're already into the blue cloth, as we say, you know we're on the right track when it comes to wargaming on the blue bays. This episode will be going out on the 6th of October, Friday the 6th of October, a couple of days before the Other Partisan show in the UK, and I shall be attending that show in a general punter capacity, and I'll be wearing my bright blue Yorkshire Gamer polo shirt. So if you enjoy the show, if you want to have a chat, by all means come up and have a quick word. Don't be afraid, I shall not bite, and it's always lovely to speak to people who listen to and enjoy the podcast. So I shall be there most of the day. I've got to get back and get to work for early evening, but I look forward to speaking to you as many as possible as I can at the show. My own Germantown game that I mentioned in the last episode is moving on nicely. I've started work on a lot of the terrain, just finishing bits and pieces off on that. My British Army is now needed some topping and tailing. That's all done. It's all put away in really useful boxes, ready to be carried. Just ordered a load of flags from Ian at Flags of War for my Americans. I'll be picking those up on Sunday, and I've done a little bit of the base work that I need to do on those Americans, and unfortunately my static grass applicator broke or didn't work, so I've had to send that back, but it's I'm reassured that it's on my way back to me, so that will be everything I need to sort the basis for that. So it's on to the interview then, and it's a lot shorter than normal, different format to normal. We're not, it's not the normal 4 parts that we would normally have. Very similar to the Papal Zouave podcast I did with Nick Schofield a while back, and if you haven't listened to that, please do so. It really is a good, informative episode, and Nick is a lovely guy, very enthusiastic about his subject, and I encourage you to listen to that. So, Peter, exactly the same. This is about paintbrushes, so if you don't like paintbrushes, you're not interested in paintbrushes, this might not be the episode for you. But if you've wondered how they're made, what they're made of, the different shapes, the handles, the processes that go into making them, and a general all-round geeky hour and 20-minute chat about paintbrushes, this is for you. I'd like to thank Peter once again for his time. He's a busy man. He's got a big business, international business to run, and I'm very grateful that he set aside an hour and a half for me to just sit down with him one Friday afternoon. This has been in the can for a little while, as I mentioned in the last episode. Work and personal stuff has stopped me getting stuff out, but it's here now. So sit back with your Yorkshire tea, your biscuit of choice, put your feet up, and listen to me and Peter getting all gooey-eyed about paintbrushes. Without further ado, here's the interview. Well, welcome once again, everyone, to the interview section of the Yorkshire Gamer Podcast. And today we've got on our bike and we've come over to one of my favourite places in the world, and that's Skipton. And I'm going to actually sit down with today's guest and have a chat in person. We've had a brew already, so things are going really well. Regular listeners will have heard me banging on about Pro Arte brushes since the very first episode nearly 3 years ago. They've been my go-to brush for the majority of my painting life. I remember first discovering them in an art shop called Dinsdale's on King Charles Street in Leeds in the late 1980s, and I haven't looked back since. Today I'm sat in the offices of Pro Arte with the main man,
Peter Thompson, and we're going to be having a chat about all things paintbrush and all things Pro Art. So Peter, welcome, and thank you kindly for taking the time to talk to us today.
That's fine, it's an absolute pleasure.
Lovely, thank you very much. And you've not done anything like this before, you were telling me?
No, this is a bit of a first for me, is this? So I'm sure it'll be interesting.
I thought you'd be a media superstar and been on Look North and everything.
Hardly.
Brilliant. So just to set the picture then, what's your role here at Pro Art?
Well, I'm the company director and pretty much look after the whole thing. We've got people sort of underneath us running offices, and I've got my son who's joined the company. But yeah, I sort of carry the business on from where my father left off. He started it back in 1973, so this is suddenly our 50th year.
It is, yeah, I've just realised that, it is. And your dad was Roy, is that right?
Roy Thompson.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about Roy. How did he get into the art world and start making brushes?
He got into the art world because he was basically enjoyed painting as a youngster, and he was very good at art, and as he progressed through school he realised that was something that he wanted to be involved in. But being a professional painter is very difficult. It's only a few that make it. So he wanted to have a career involved in art, materials or art in some way, and he subsequently joined Winsor & Newton.
Okay.
Who were seen as the sort of classiest act in the trade, back in the day. And he spent 20 years with Winsor & Newton. And basically his role with Windsor's was the sales manager. Back in the day, you got a job, and people move from job to job quite freely these days. But back in those days, you got a job, and it was
you stayed with the company for life, didn't you?
Perceived as a job for life, and that's what he wanted, and he wanted to work his way up the ladder. And back in the day, Winsor & Newton would invest in you as well, because he'd told me stories that he'd been involved in factory production before they let you loose on the road. Visiting art shops. You had to have a deep, proper knowledge of the product. So you spent a year in the colour factory and in different parts of the company. So that was where he sort of began.
And how did he then progress from working for Winsor & Newton to starting Pro Art?
Well, he was a good salesman.
Was he?
And he had aspirations possibly to be their sales manager.
Yeah.
And that never arrived, and I think he got very frustrated with that because he would tell me stories that he'd come up with various ideas for displaying products and marketing things, and some of his ideas were sort of brushed under the carpet, and he sort of got to a point where he reached sort of early middle age and thought, well, hang on, I'm not really progressing anymore. And that was maybe because he was such a good salesman.
Yeah.
And he was a very good salesman, very persuasive. And
he would be valuable to that company in that role, wouldn't he?
Exactly. He covered a big area. It was the whole of the north of England. And he was very good at his job. So that situation was, he sort of reached a brick wall where he thought perhaps that's the end of the road. So he thought, right, okay, if we're going to progress further, then you get on your bike and you do it yourself. And that's really, how that part of the story sort of.
Did the company start in Skipton, or did it start elsewhere?
No, it started elsewhere. Back in the day, we used to live in Leeds.
Okay.
Temple Newsam.
Near
Whitkirk. Whitkirk in Leeds. And he had a big bungalow, and he kitted the loft out. Yeah. And that was his packing room.
Oh, fantastic.
Back in the day, we didn't manufacture products because when you first start out, he didn't have that knowledge of manufacturing. So he did have contacts within the trade, and he managed to source good, high-quality products from a couple of companies in the UK. One of them was based in London, and they used to provide him with all his high-quality soft hair brushes, the sable and squirrel brushes. Company up in Newcastle provided him with the sort of cheaper craft side of things, more the educational type of product. And it was a very basic range back in those days, back in the early 70s. Synthetics hadn't hit the marketplace. Yeah. So, it was a fairly simple, straightforward line of product that he managed to procure, and off he went selling them. So his first area was his old customers in the north of England,
Yeah.
who would then say to him, well, you've always told me that Winsor & Newton products are the best in the world. Now you're telling me your products are the best in the world. So that's where he had to be very persuasive once again.
I think he's done a good job over the years.
He's done a good job. But that's the thing when you're a salesman. You're selling a product, but you're selling yourself.
Yeah.
And I think he'd managed to build up this wonderful rapport with many of his long-standing dealers. He'd been covering that territory for 20 years, and people knew him and people liked him, and so he'd built up this great relationship with people. And so for him, selling throughout the north of England was relatively easy. It was breaking into the rest of the country that was more difficult.
So how did young Peter then, obviously heavily influenced by your dad, were you into art yourself?
Strangely enough, as I say, it skips a generation. No, not particularly very good at drawing or painting or anything.
Yeah.
Like, from that sort of creative angle.
Yeah.
But, I've always been very practical.
Yeah.
And I saw my father build a business from scratch, going through various highs and lows. And as a youngster, I just had that feeling that I wanted to be involved in it myself. And from a young age, I used to help out in the packing room and just being part of it. And I watched my father. He used to take me out doing sales calls.
Oh, right, wow.
So it was something that I had that feeling that I wanted to emulate him. That's really how I sort of came into the business. But I did. I wasn't particularly academic. I was. Ended up, I think, with 3 O levels, but I did manage to get. I stayed on into the sixth form. Managed to get myself an A level.
Oh, excellent!
In woodwork, which I enjoyed massively, and as I say, that's been my thing. The practicality of it, and that's where the manufacturing sort of started, because without me joining the business, we may never have been manufacturing products ourselves. And if you want a bit of a story behind that all came about probably by a stroke of luck.
Yeah.
My father always recognised that it would be important for us, rather than just be distributors buying in and selling out, that you've got to manufacture at some point to be taken very seriously. So that was always the chief goal. Now, one of the companies that we used to buy the high-end products from, who were based in London, they actually went out of business. The business was run very badly. And anyway, at that point, I was about 18 at the time, 18, 19, it was in the early 80s, and we took the opportunity. I'd already spent 6 months up in Newcastle with a different company learning how to make brushes, and they were quite happy to teach me, because they thought that it would be two-way traffic, because synthetics were coming onto the market. So I was up there to learn, but to help them develop the synthetic brushes. So I'd already learned basic brush making with them. But when the company down in London went bust, we employed some of their outworkers, and it was at that point then I learnt how to make real high quality traditional brushes, your sables, your squirrels. They were already also making some sable nylon mixers, not very well.
Yeah.
But the beauty is, having been able to learn high end sable and squirrel, when you know how a good brush is made, it then paves the way for you to develop new products, because you understand how a brush works. And I suppose the other side of the coin is, my father being a practicing artist, he was really more of an oil painter, but he understood watercolour painting intimately as well. So it was the perfect vehicle to develop products, because I was learning the difference between good quality and high quality and rubbish, and my father would put me straight, and and we were in that situation where we could develop high-end products.
Fantastic. And clearly starting, if we're year 50 now for Pro Arte, so you're clearly doing something right, because you're still here.
Yeah.
And so how did it develop from that packing in your dad's loft to where we are now in a mill in Skipton?
Well, it's a number of stepping stones. You don't just suddenly start from a loft and buy a 3-storey Yorkshire mill. My father moved, or my parents moved from Leeds over to Sutton and Craven. And we started in a very, very small way, basically in an office block at the bottom of his garden. Just a couple of rooms, just making 2 or 3 ranges of sable brushes. And then we rented a property in Cross Hills by the railway line, and that was fun because every time the truck from Tilcon comes through, the whole building. But we were there for 9 years. We signed a 9-year lease, and it did us proud. By the time we moved out, the whole place was packed to the rafters.
Oh, brilliant!
But it did a good job, and in the intervening time, we saw Park Mill in Skipton. It came available back in the sort of mid-90s, and we purchased that. I think it was 96 when we purchased it, and we didn't move in right away. We spent 3 years spending a lot of money renovating it and kitting it out and modernising it and making it just right for what we wanted. And normally a lot of people don't want an old building like a Yorkshire mill, but it's with a great deal of pride that we accommodate this building, because it's it was a traditional woolen spinning mill, and making a handmade Yorkshire product, and essentially that's what we're now doing. We're making a handmade product. We've got various machines that will help us do various tasks within brush making, but to all intents and purposes it's still a handmade product that we're producing here. So, I feel very proud that we've been able to utilise a good old mill. Yeah,
a classic historical building within classic historical town. It's great. It's great to see it in use.
Yeah,
because a lot of old mills, as you know, they've either gone to rack and ruin or they've been turned into posh flats or whatever.
Well, the staff love it. The staff love it because it's just a 5-minute walk into town.
Yeah.
Whereas if we were on an industrial park, then you're out of it.
Well, there's some good fish and chip shops within 5 minutes walk from here, isn't there?
Absolutely. That's the thing about. There's something about this area. The fish and chips are phenomenal. I'll go to Whitby, I'll go to Scarborough. You get fish and chips, and it's disappointing. They're just full of skin and bone.
Oh God, yeah. Well, there's the little one just down here on the end,
Westmoreland
Street. Yeah,
yep.
That's
a belter.
One of the best fish and chips I've ever had.
Well, Andrew on Newmarket Street, he cooks them fresh. When you walk in the shop, he'll ask what you're having.
Is that Newgate Fisheries?
Newmarket
Fisheries, yeah.
Andrew, I'm just trying to think of his second name. I can't think of it now. Terrible with names, but brilliant fish and chips there.
We always end up talking about fish and chips on this podcast.
And then we've got 2 busy Lizzies in town as well. We can't move for fish and chip shops here.
And they're all decent as well. They're all decent. They're right abandoned in there. So perfect location. So you kind of alluded to it there. Everything happens here. Your manufacturing, your storing, your distribution.
It does.
All from this location.
Yeah. It was bought with the future in mind, and it seemed a gulf of a building when we first moved in, and yet we filled it as you tend to do. So it works very, very nicely for us. As I say, a 3-storey mill. We've got the work area on the top floor. We've got most of the storage on the middle floor, and we've got all the finished goods on the packing on the ground floor. So as I say, there's a lift shaft in there with a working lift, so that's great. We can get goods up and down. And because it's light industry, then it doesn't need to be on one level. It works beautifully on 3 floors, so it does a really good job for us.
Excellent. So, not wanting to give any company secrets away, or as we go through all this, because later on we'll talk about brush development and stuff. So, sales then, are you go into art shops, model shops? How does the sales process work? Do you have an online direct sales? How do you work?
We don't. We like to support all our dealers, and the way we support all our dealers is that we don't sort of cut the throat and go direct.
Right.
We have a website. Gone are the days of having catalogues. You print them, and the moment you print them, they're out of date.
Yeah.
We have a website which we can update whenever we want, and that keeps. There's a dealer area, so dealers can download price lists and order forms and that side of it, and the rest is informational for the end user. So that's the way it works. We don't sell direct.
Yeah.
What we do, we support our dealers. We've got a number of art shops, not as many as we used to have, but we've got art shops that cover the country, and that's what we do. We manufacture brochures to support the art shops through a number of displays that we have.
You know, I have to say, from being a customer, there's not many art shops I go into in the UK where there isn't a Pro Art stand with all the stuff there. So you've clearly got a good grasp of the market with the art shops. We were talking just before we started about model shops, and they've kind of closed. A lot of them have closed down, haven't they? Which is a real shame.
Yeah, they've disappeared, and it is a shame. But the same thing has happened in the art trade, but to a lesser degree. I think the thing with art materials, it's a sort of tactile product that people still want to go around a shop and choose the products that they want. There's a vibe and a feel and a smell about the place.
Yeah.
And art shops are quite special. And most art shops have never been right in the centre of town. They've usually been on the periphery. So although we have lost a lot of art shops over the years, then the ones that are left are working harder and probably doing as well as they've ever done, if not better. Because to retail these days, you've got to be switched on. Many of them have their own websites, which augment some of the sales, and then you've got the other side of the coin that we've got a number of bespoke mail order dealers who are selling art materials purely online.
Yeah.
So when shops close, then usually some of that business will be hoovered up by some of the mail order dealers. So thankfully, it doesn't disappear. But it has been a bit soul destroying to watch a lot of shops disappear by the wayside.
Yeah.
But yeah, to come to what you were saying about the model shops, we did look at this a number of years ago. We realised that suddenly there aren't many model shops left anymore.
They've all gone.
Which is a shame, because when I was a lad, there were model shops everywhere.
Yeah.
I think the only real one that we supply there's one in Leeds, Crossgates in Leeds.
Yeah.
And I think it's called the Leeds Model Shop or the Leeds Model Centre.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful shop.
It is. It's a
But
really
they
nice
are
shop.
few and far between.
There's a big one in Halifax Model
Right.
Shop. That's similar sort of thing to the Leeds one. But like you say, 20, 30 miles between shops where you would... I remember there used to be one on the old road coming over from Lancashire down Cowlin. I can't remember whether it...
I think there was.
There was a model shop up there years ago.
There was a model shop in Cone. Keighley had a model shop.
Yeah.
But they've all disappeared. So that's a shame.
So it is a real shame. And I think you said it a few moments ago. There's something about going into a shop to buy a brush. And you know, I might look at 5 brushes, all the same size, all the same make, all the same hair, and I'll pick one of them.
Yep.
And I want that one.
That's right, but that's art materials in general.
Yeah.
And I think that's what stands us in good stead. People will always be creative to a degree. I mean, we watched the graphic industry disappear. Very rarely do you get an art shop just purely run as an art shop. It's usually on the back of something, so it may be art and stationery. It may be art and, well, it used to be art and graphic. Many of the shops were art and graphic shops. And then as graphics went, then they'd replace the graphics with crafts. But computers came along and decimated traditional graphic design.
Yeah.
So it all changed. But I touch wood, and I thank my lucky stars that art in general should, and you know, you can never count your chickens, but it should continue to thrive, because people will always want to be creative. They'll always want to create and paint and do different arts and crafts, whatever it may be, because that's what people want to do in their spare time, or many people want to do. So hopefully it's something that won't die out. So yeah, I feel very lucky, because when we watch other industries disappear and decline, then it's quite sad.
Yeah, I think there's always an outlay for creativity, and certainly from my side of the wargaming hobby, you would think that more people would game online, but there's something with the tactile nature of it, the fact that you're dealing with real things and you've got to prepare them and paint them, and there's an area of love involved in it, if you like, rather than just switching on a computer and playing a game. You have to work to get there. So there's a process involved in that I think will always be there. I think there'll be always a need for paintbrushes.
Good.
Very good.
Well, the other nice thing about painting is, painting, as they say, art is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
But the beauty of actually creating a painting is that you're creating something unique.
Yeah.
I've watched people do card making at craft shows, and you get 20 people around a table, and by the time they've finished, they've all got this exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I've watched 20 people follow an artist with all their own painting kit, and when they're finished, they've all got completely different paintings.
Yeah.
So they're unique, and that's what the marvellous thing is. So whether it's good or bad, I've seen some amazing stuff, and I've seen some stuff that's, I say to myself, well, I could have done better with my eyes shut. But I'm not critical, and one should never be critical, because people get an awful lot of enjoyment from painting as well.
It's not always about the end product.
Absolutely,
is it?
but that's the thing.
The
You're creating something unique, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that potted history of the company. That's very kind of you, and gives all the listeners sort of an idea of Pro Arte. And I'm going to move on now and get all geeky about brushes, if that's all right.
Yep, no, that's
because I as I said to you before we started the interview, I've been painting for a very long time, and I was doing a bit of research, as I always do before I do these podcasts, and I'm going through the Pro Arte catalogue, and it's like, I've never heard of that. What's that? What does that do? So if you don't mind, we'll have a chat about the various aspects of brushes, and what they're made of and how they're made, etc. From the very, very basics to a little bit more detail, just to give our listeners an idea of what actually goes into that thing that they're holding in the hand.
Absolutely.
And hopefully not accidentally dipping it in the Yorkshire tea rather than the water.
Well, if they dip it in Yorkshire tea, it won't damage it, that's for sure.
Perfect. So you talked earlier on about learning how to make brushes then. So what without not necessarily going into the materials, we'll talk about that in a moment, but what's the process of making a brush then? What goes into it?
Well, quite simply, the most important part of the brush is the hair that the brush is made from, because that's the product, the part of the brush that's doing all the work. So whether it's sable, squirrel, nylon, then Pro Arte will try and procure the best possible materials that we can.
Yeah.
But I mean, what goes into making a brush? Basically, you've got the metal ferrule part, which has to be filled with the correct amount of fibre.
Yeah. Whatever it is.
Whatever that fibre is. Once the correct amount of hair is selected, then it's up to the brush makers to produce that brush to a high standard, which means that it's got to be shaped correctly.
Yeah.
If a brush isn't shaped correctly for the task that it's doing, then it's really of no use.
Yeah.
So that's the important part of making a brush, and then the rest of it follows on.
Yeah.
Handles are printed, fixed to the brush heads. Everything's got to be. We use glues and all sorts of things, but obviously the business end of the brush is the fibre and the way that brush has been put together.
Yeah. So we'll talk about the types of brushes first then. So I'll just get a bit like a quick question thing. I'll shout one out and you tell me what it is and what it does. Okay. So I've written all these down. So a straight one, a round brush then, is that the one that we're all familiar with?
That's the one that everyone uses. Everyone will use a round brush, because it's basically in a round ferrule, and it's a pointed brush. Not all pointed. You can have a sign writer's brush that's got a flat tip, because they wanted to do lettering work. But on the whole, most brushes that you'll see are a round brush with a point on the end of them. So, and the idea of having a point at the end is to be able to impart the paint in a different manner, i.e. using the very tip of the brush for a fine line and pressing harder so you can get a thicker line.
Yeah.
So the bigger the brush that can point, you've got a very versatile brush. That's the crux of it.
So how are the points formed then? Are they obviously part of the manufacturing process, but how do you get them into that point?
Well, we create the point in two ways, depending on the actual fibre. A sable or a squirrel hair brush is there's a bulk of hair that's tied, and we use a special knot to tie the brush, and it's rolled in the hands or rolled in the fingers to create the point, and it pushes the centre of the fibre out to create a dome shape. And when you've got the right shape, then you tighten the knot, cut the back and put it into the ferrule. And then once it's in the ferrule and pulled to the correct length, it will then go through a gluing process so that the hair is actually cemented into the ferrule itself. The process is done slightly differently with a synthetic brush, because the nature of the hair is different, and you can't tie it because it's a much harder fibre is synthetic. So we actually shape the synthetic fibre within the ferrule. We drop the right amount of hair into the ferrule. Once we've selected the right amount, we then put it into what we call a cannon, which is a shaped piece of wood or plastic, and the hair will conform to the shaping at the base of the cannon. And we use a shaker machine which helps drop the hair into shape, basically. But the hair has to be shaped to a point in order to make the brush work.
So doing the sable by hand then, that sounds quite skilled.
It's very much a skilled job, and it has to be a skilled job because sable hair is a very expensive commodity.
It's not cheap, is it?
If you're not careful, you can sneeze £1,000 worth of sable away.
It's like saffron with cooking, isn't it? That tiny little bit of saffron.
Exactly.
Worth a fortune.
It's not quite as expensive as gold, but we're not
far off.
Yeah.
So the idea, I believe, is that the point is where you paint with, and then the round behind it is kind of a store for paint, and it flows down into the point.
That's pretty much correct. Yeah. Now a sable brush will look a little bit different to a synthetic brush because of the actual nature of the hair. Sable hair has what they call a belly, so it's got a little bit of a thicker part, about two-thirds of the way down, and that's what gives the sable its distinctive sort of domed shape. It's like an Indian arch almost, whereas a synthetic brush will come out of the ferrule pretty much in a straight line before it goes to a sharp point. So a sable brush carries quite a lot more colour than synthetic, and that's where synthetic brushes are limited as opposed to the natural hairbrush. But we have improved them over the years, and we may go into that a bit later.
Talk about when we talk about the materials used. So one thing that is always discussed on painting forums that I'm involved in is when you paint in detail, and some people prefer a very fine brush, a 4-0, 5-0, 3-0, whatever, really down the low end, whereas other people will use a bigger brush, but with a finer tip. So is there anything from your company's point of view regarding that? Would you have a point of view on it?
Well, from our point of view, we always try and create all our brushes to contain the best and the sharpest point that they possibly can. It's harder on a bigger brush. The bigger the brush, the more difficult it is to maintain a very sharp point. Hence, this is why a lot of people will buy a little minute treble naught, or we go down to a 10-0.
Wow.
in one of the ranges.
Is that like two hairs?
Yeah, some people say they're great for painting eyes and things like, which they are,
Yeah.
which they are.
Yeah.
But personally, I've done a little bit of scale model painting, and I can quite easily get away with a size 0.
Yeah.
Because I find that brush will carry a little bit more colour than the 10-0.
Yeah.
So you're not having to dip in all the time. But as long as that brush has got a good point on, you should be able to get as fine a detail. It's down to, some people
personal preference.
It is personal preference, because some people will argue that there is no substitute for a 10-0 for what they want to do. And I can understand that. But this is why we do a whole range of sizes. Coming back to sort of traditional, watercolour painting techniques, years ago when synthetics first hit the marketplace, you couldn't buy mega big brushes because buying big sable brushes was far too expensive. But we were able to develop a synthetic brush, big size 20, which would hold a lovely sharp point. And that was a painter's dream, because they could almost use one brush to do a whole range of techniques. You can put a big background wash on by just not using the point and not worrying about the point. But if you dry that brush off a little bit, you've got a lovely point to work with. So they were doing, fine detail work with a very, very large brush.
Yeah.
So it's always been something that we've been aware of. It just makes a brush very versatile if you've always got a good sharp point on that brush.
So that's rounds. Flats. What are they used for? What?
Pretty basic brushes of flats.
Yeah.
But flats are very useful. A lot of people will simply use a flat just for doing background blocking work, base coating. If the chisel edge part is very useful. A lot of people will paint landscapes, but within landscapes you also get buildings. So the flat part of the brush is great, because you can use that flat part to create brickwork or to do background work up to straight edges. Yeah. So, but in their own right, flat brushes are very, very useful.
It's not. I've tended to use them, like you say, for big areas, because they can hold a decent amount of paint and slap it on basically and get the coverage sorted out.
Well, that's where the point isn't as necessary, because and that's why. But a big flat brush, a decorator will tell you it's the same sort of thing. You're imparting as much paint as you can, depending on the size of that brush.
Yeah, brilliant. We're going a little bit more off piece now. A filbert.
A filbert is quite simple. Yep. Again, a landscape artist would use a filbert more. Very similar to a round, but again, it's a cross between a round and a flat brush. So where the point isn't quite as important, but you don't want that sharp flat edge, because again, within a natural landscape, you don't see many straight lines. So that's where a filbert sort of covers that middle ground. You can get a lot of colour on, but you haven't got that sharp flat edge that you may not want. Is
it more of an oil painting brush, a filbert? I'm not sure.
It tends to be. Yeah. There's a bit of a rule of thumb that within the watercolour, for watercolour painting, the majority of painters will use a round, then a flat, then a filbert.
Right.
Oil painting's a little bit different. They tend to use flats first of all, and then a filbert, and then perhaps a round.
Right.
So that's just the way it tends to be. It's certainly reflected in our sales anyway. Yeah,
it's something I have to say that I've never used. And a fan.
Well, just before we go on to the fan, my father used to say, if you can't use a round, a flat, or a filbert, then there's something wrong with you. I mean, nowadays there's this mass of brushes, and fans are one of them. There was a lovely gentleman called Terry Harrison who developed all sorts of brushes for doing all sorts of different techniques. And that simplifies it and makes life a lot easier for a lot of artists. And it opens the door to a lot of painters. So I embrace it. It's great. But coming back to the question, the fan brush, again, as the name implies, it's a brush that's fanned out and it creates multiple points.
Right.
So that then enables you to do a multitude of things. Colour blending, because you're not blending one heavy colour into another. Doing things like multiple lines, so fur on animals, grasses. Some people stipple away with them and use them for tree foliage. I've seen fan brushes used for many different things. So again, quite a versatile brush.
Yeah, well, that's good information, because I was looking at them last night and going, what the bloody hell would I use that for?
Yeah.
No, I like that. That's a good one. The rigger brush.
The rigger, well, have a guess.
It's I think that I've seen them used for like sign writing and stuff like that. It's like a long stroke of a...
Well, the sign writing version of the rigger tends to have a flat edge, so you can do lettering work. But the rigger, it comes from doing the rigging on ships.
Right.
And the idea is that you can do these lovely long lines without your paint running out.
Yeah.
If you use a normal round brush, then you run the risk of you getting halfway through a brush stroke and then, hang on, it's running out of paint.
Yeah.
Where a rigger, because it's longer, it's carrying more colour, and then you can do longer lines. So it's simple as that. But that's where it comes from.
I never thought of that.
Doing the
I
rigging.
like that one. Because I've got a couple of riggers, but I don't really use them that much. I tend to use them for getting into hard to reach places, because the brush is longer without, because occasionally with the metal bit is the ferrule. Occasionally that will scratch a model if you're trying to get into something. So I will tend to use riggers for like a telescopic paintbrush, if you like, to get into.
Well, for some people, the rigger, the full rigger, can be a little bit unwieldy. So we do an in-between brush, which is called a half rigger. It's a little bit shorter, and it just makes life easier for some people. So much of it is personal preference. And I think at this stage, while I remember, there is, the rule of thumb with any brush is, it is personal preference. I see brushes, you create a brush to do a certain thing, and you see someone using it to do something completely different. So it's fluid. It's ultimately it's a brush. It's a sort of tactile product that you can use pretty much for whatever you want. I mean, I've seen watercolour painters use bristle brushes. That's a rarity. But for some people that works. And whereas a sable isn't normally associated for oil painting, I've come across people that love sables for oil painting. So there are these crossovers. So it's very much, how you can use a brush and how it works for you.
And then going through there's loads of stuff that seems to be like little sort of variations on. So there was like the sword.
The sword liner is a glorified rigger, essentially. It's a lovely brush. It just enables you to carry a lot more colour than a rigger. And because of the sword shape, you can do the long fine lines as you would with a rigger, but you can do these lovely sort of oblique lines as well. And they're great because silk painters and people like that can use them effectively, as I say, because of the volume of paint that they can carry.
They kind of fan out, don't they, to have a larger area?
Well, it's got a large, what they call a belly area, and then because of the sword shape, it comes to a very, very fine point at the tip. So you can paint long, fine lines. And if you just want to use it for fine lining, you can. The beauty of it is, if you press harder, it'll give you a thicker line. So you can vary that brush stroke, if you will. But if you paint, so that you can almost paint sideways to create these lovely leaf effects and things like that.
Oh, superb. A chisel edge.
A chisel edge is quite simply a flat brush again.
But with a finer point?
Some people call them a flat, some people call them a one stroke, some people call them a chisel. But effectively it's a flat brush that just comes to a sharp when you look at it down one plane, it's a sharp point along the tip. But you'll probably come onto this, and I'm probably preempting it, but there is one called an angled chisel or an angled flat. And it's the same thing. It's just variations on a flat brush. So whether it's an angle or a chisel, to all intents and purposes, they're very much the same thing.
But so But the vast majority of your sales then are the round, the flat, and the filbert. They're the three big,
they're the three
big ones.
Yeah.
And then everything else has its place, and some people find weird places to use those things that they weren't originally designed for.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And all praise to them, because I think with art, whatever it is, whether it's a picture or a model, everyone has their own style, and sometimes part of that style is using a brush that other people might not use.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been off and done art shows, and it's by talking to people and seeing the way they paint and some of the ideas that they come up with, that you then develop a new product. The sword liner was one of them.
Yeah.
The original one was a much shorter version called a dagger brush, which is still available now, and it's part of our range. But it led on to the sword liner because people would say, oh, this is doing a job, but it's not quite doing what I want it to do. So we create something because of a need, a requirement for it.
Oh, brilliant. So we'll move on then to the materials that things are made from. And reading through the About Pro Art on your website, the development of Proline was part of the company's development as well.
Yep.
So just talk to us about the natural and the synthetics sort of barrier first, before we go into the more detailed areas of the different types of those two.
Well, Proline was the big synthetic breakthrough.
Yeah.
Back in the 70s when my father started, as I said before, it was all natural material, sable, squirrel, bristle, pony hair, that sort of thing for the different brushes. There was no such thing as synthetics. And then synthetics were developed, I suppose, as a result of the clothing industry. The polyester filaments that we may see on fleece jackets and things are made from a very, very minutely fine material, which is woven, spun, or whatever it's done with. But someone at some point obviously came up with the idea that if they produce a thicker grade, then it would have different uses in the, whether it be the artist brush or the paintbrush in general industry. So obviously synthetics were developed from polyester filament. Now the hard part of producing that, which I still don't fully understand today, we buy our hair from hair manufacturers, through brokers, through all sorts of channels. But a piece of polyester fibre that's just cut into lengths is of no use at all.
Yeah.
Each fibre has got to contain a point. Quite how that's achieved, I'm still not entirely sure.
So what are the secrets?
But well, it is one of the secrets. Anyway, we buy hair in bundles, usually 50 millimeters or up to 70 millimeters for the larger brushes, and it's beautiful quality, and it's all tipped. Originally, it was all produced in Japan. Synthetics were the big breakthrough, because up until then, you only had traditional hair.
Yeah.
And the problem is, good quality artist brushes, squirrels a little bit soft, great for watercolorists, for wash work. But if you wanted to do detail work, it's a bit softer squirrel. So that's where sable is a better product to use, because it contains a better spring and better working properties, but it's very, very expensive. So synthetics, it was groundbreaking, because it gave us, for the first time, a viable alternative at a much less expensive.
And is there a higher level of consistency with the synthetics? Because obviously your sables and your squirrels are coming from animals, and every animal is different. So whereas the Proline is coming from a synthetic process, so is it more consistent?
It's totally consistent. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some of the natural hair, it depends upon climate as well. So high end Kolinsky sable is essentially from the real cold regions of the earth, and if one season is colder than another, then that means the hair has more spring, more resilience. As the climate's warming up, then the quality, sadly, is declining. But the beauty is, with synthetics, since they were developed, that they're actually improving all the time.
Yeah.
So in answer to your question, absolutely.
Yeah, because a synthetic is a technological advance, isn't it? Rather than us as humans searching for an animal with the right type of hair to paint with.
That's why we love synthetics, because they are consistent. And yeah, from an ethical point of view, it's great. It enables us to produce something that then the customer has the choice. If they want a sable, they can buy a sable. But if they're vegan or whatever, or then they can go for the synthetics. So it's lovely to be able to give that choice.
So there's Kolinsky sable, pure sable, Renaissance sable I've picked up from your ranges.
There's so many different ranges of sable. Well, we gave Renaissance sable its name because there was a Renaissance. Sable had been so expensive for so many years, and then as a result, of synthetics becoming more and more prevalent, then I suppose there was a glut in the sable market because people had stopped using sables to the degree that they used to use, and were moving towards synthetics. So the price of sable came down massively, and we were able to procure some good stocks of sable at a very, very affordable price. So we were able to, I suppose, reinvent sable as it were, because our original ranges had become very, very expensive, and we'd basically stopped selling them. So yeah, when we relaunched Renaissance, it was a renaissance of the market, the sable market. But
so it's not like 15th century sable that you found in a warehouse somewhere in Italy or something like that.
No, I'm sure that would have all been moth-eaten, flea-bitten.
It's great. It's great to see them. The renaissance of sable brushes, and many.
Well, there isn't really a renaissance anymore, unfortunately, because sable, again, more recently. I mean, we launched Renaissance probably about 15 years ago, but within the last 3 years, sable and squirrel prices have rocketed again to an alarming degree. So as a result of that, it's made us go back to the drawing board and look at further alternatives.
A lot of painters will insist on sable brushes, and obviously that's their personal preference. Is there a huge difference between the two types, a good quality synthetic and a good quality sable?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Some people will swear by sable, and in all honesty, Winsor & Newton have had this remarkable record for their Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush.
7, yeah.
It's a magnificent brush, and I'll openly say that. They procure that hair, they dress it themselves. Everything about it is a lovely brush. People do tell me that the quality has declined, and that's not Windsor's fault. That's probably because of a warming planet. But not only, well, they're also facing the same problems that we are with procuring good quality sable. It's very difficult. So it's made the prices absolutely unbearable. A Series 7 brush, I think the starting price is about £25 for the smallest
cheap
brush.
Yeah.
They're horrendously expensive. But as I say, they are very, very good quality. But coming back to the synthetic, I actually prefer using a synthetic brush as opposed to a sable, particularly on, the smaller sizes up to, let's say, a size 3 or size 4. I prefer the synthetic, because I just find it more manageable. It'll carry a similar amount of colour. I think the beauty of sable is it's when you get onto the larger sizes, they'll carry a lot more colour than a synthetic brush, and they'll give you a softer, smoother coverage. I think if you're doing base coating work and background work, that's brilliant. However, there are flats available to do a lot of that work at a much cheaper price than buying a big expensive sable.
Yeah.
So I think the days of sable are numbered unless the prices dropped massively, because they have gone up alarmingly over the last few years.
Yeah, but I think there's always going to be that group of artists who will always insist on.
There will.
I've used Sable, I've used Proline, synthetics, all different types of brushes over the years. And I've got to be honest and say, I can't tell a massive difference between the two at all.
No.
The Sables occasionally last a little bit longer, but is that because I'm really cleaning it because I've spent a bloody fortune on it?
Because you're taking care of them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I'm never going to get, I don't know what, 2-3 times more use from a Sable than I am from spending the equivalent amount on synthetic brushes. I don't think I'm ever going to reach that point.
No.
They last maybe a few months longer. So yeah, it's an interesting one that some people do hang on to that. I must have Sable.
Yeah. I still come across that.
Yeah.
And again, it's down to personal preference, and that's absolutely fine.
He talks about squirrel, and I wasn't aware that squirrel was a brush type.
Yeah. A lot of wash brushes are used, or squirrel is used.
Yeah.
For many of the high-end wash brushes.
Oh, I never thought of that. I take it that's grey squirrel rather than
No,
red.
they don't use it. It's again, grey squirrel would be absolutely useless. We live in too warm a climate here. There's Canadian blue squirrel or Russian Kazan squirrel that's available. But again, as I say, the costs have gone up. Goat hair is a very good substitute. We've had goat hair mops in our range for a long time. Again, there's different qualities, but there's a round wash brush, which is a very basic brush, which does a really good job for background wash work. And then there's a much better brush that we use as an alternative to pure squirrel, which works nearly as well. It's a much higher grade quality of goat hair, and that's made in a traditional quill style mop. So there are substitutes and alternatives available.
A little bit of an in-joke from the podcast that you won't be aware of, but one of my friends, Sean, he likes to spend no more than £2 on a set of 6 brushes.
Good luck to him.
Yeah, and we've suggested that they might be made from rat hair. So has rat hair ever come across as a potential use for brushes?
I wouldn't have thought so. Maybe the rat's tail.
Yeah, Sean's allergic to spending money on brushes.
I was going to say, he'll never get a decent range of brushes for £2.
No.
He might buy a couple of brushes for £2.
He gets through them very quickly.
Yeah.
I don't know why. he gets through very quickly. Also in your range, you've got lots of different types of synthetics. I've written down here polar, nylon, prolon, sabline, acrylics, sterling acrylics, bristline. How do they differ?
Well, they differ basically because you're using different grades of fibre for different purposes. So the acrylics and the sterling acrylics will use much heavier grade synthetic hair because it needs to be stiffer, so it'll carry the heavier filaments for oil painting. And a lot of people, well, oil painting is more of a traditional thing. Acrylics have become quite big in the marketplace now, but acrylics is very versatile because it can be thinned to pretty much whatever consistency an artist wants. But using sort of thick, heavy impasto acrylic, heavy body acrylic, it can be used just like an oil paint. And a lot of people prefer that because it dries much faster than oil paint. But essentially, those grades of synthetic fibre are used for the heavier grade paint, and then you've got your softer Proline brushes, which were originally developed for watercolour painting.
Right. Yeah.
You've got your again. Well, bristline is a similar thing to the acrylics. That's a heavier grade developed for the oil painter, and then the more modern sabline. That's another more modern development. It's a step further, I suppose, from Proline. Proline still has and will always have a place in its own right because of the way it's blended. We use 3 different filaments that we blend together, and we blend them in different mixers depending on the brush size.
Right.
So you may get some sizes of brushes that have one blend. As you move up the range, it may have another blend. Back in the early days when synthetics were first developed, A lot of brush manufacturers thought, right, we'll grab that grade and we'll make certain sizes from it, and they work to a certain degree. But what we recognised is that natural hair has different thickness filaments.
Yeah.
So we thought, right, if we start mixing different grades together, it'll create different amounts of air pockets within the brush, which are good for colour holding, and it gives the brush a softer feel than just using, the same grade right the way through a brush. So that was how Proline was developed. But since then, obviously, new synthetic materials have become available. One is a particular development that was done for the cosmetic industry, and they call it wave synthetic.
Oh, right.
And what they've done, they've created, instead of the filament being absolute straight as a die, it's got various twists and turns and bends within the fibre. So when you group fibres together, it creates even bigger air pockets, and that's where Sabline comes in.
Right.
What we managed to do is use some wave synthetic mixed with normal synthetic, and again we vary it throughout the range, but by using the wave synthetic it creates a bigger, more bulbous shape like a sable brush.
Right.
So when you look at that brush, it's got a traditional, what we call a belly on there, that will, when it protrudes out of the ferrule, before it comes to a point, it'll have a thicker belly, which enables it to hold a lot more colour than a normal synthetic. So it's taken synthetics to a higher level again.
So we're kind of getting a crossover there in between, as the name would suggest, between a sable and a synthetic.
Exactly.
Yeah, so they're doing kind of part of the job that a sable would do within a synthetic.
Well, that's right. Well, back in the early days of synthetics, when only really sable and squirrel and natural hair was available, then that was the time we developed Proline, because we realised we had to create a viable alternative as well as we possibly could to satisfy the needs of watercolour paint. So that was then. Proline has been developed. I mean, we're on probably Mark IV grade of Proline now. Nothing stands still. You keep developing certain products when you come up with new ideas. But as I say, because of recent developments and because of the recent cost of sable and squirrel going outrageously expensive and through the roof, we thought, right, we've got to try again. We've got to take this thing even further. And we sat down with our hair suppliers and we discussed different synthetics that had come onto the market. And as I say, we were able to produce something that now resembles a sable better than ever before. So it's good that we can take that further and give people these alternatives.
Yeah.
So
no, it's good to see. Good to see that everything is continuously developing. And the one I've got left is hog. Is it actually hog hair?
It comes from a pig. It's bristle hair.
Right.
Yeah. Well. Sable and squirrel hair will always be frowned upon because of, I suppose, you don't kill those animals for food.
No.
It's. I think the misconception is that people will see people flaunting themselves in London or wherever with animal furs on. So it's very much frowned upon because we don't need fur coats in this country, and yet in Siberia, Outer Mongolia, indigenous people kill these animals for fur, and the tail of the animal is where the longer lengths of hair come from. Yeah. So back in the day, it was known as furrier's waste. So brush makers would come along, and instead of it being thrown away, then it then became a marketable product. Yeah. So that's how brushes would be made. They'd be made from the tail of an animal. Pig bristle, goat hair, these animals are being killed for food. People may not agree with animals being killed full stop, but at the end of the day, we're making the use of a byproduct. So every part of that animal will be used. And
in hog hair, is that like stippling brush, or because I would imagine it's quite
again, it's a coarse, stiff filament, so that would be used as an oil painting brush. That's how it would have been developed. Long handle oil painting brushes, again, to cope with the thicker, heavier paints. Yeah. But like you say, with stippling, Bristle is used, for stippling brushes, stencil brushes, all that type of thing.
Something that can take a bit of
hammer.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a coarse. If
you do that with your sable brush, you're not doing it any favours, are you? And then the final bit about the brush making itself then is the handles. Are you all wood? Do you use plastic?
We've never used plastics.
Yeah.
It is all wood. Some people don't like the fact that forests are being cut down, but we don't want to use plastics. So we use, there's a company that we use in actual fact in Germany for all our brush handles, and it's all certificated, so it comes from sustainable forest. And different types of wood has been used over the years, depending on the council that say, right, well, we can't use ramin. Ramin was a very straight-grained wood, and then that was taken away from the marketplace, and it was replaced by, I think, birch wood at the moment. But once it's all lacquered and finished, there's something about the weight of wood that gives you that nice sort of feel in the hand.
Yeah, I think it probably won't sound daft to you, but it feels like it breathes.
Yeah.
When I'm painting, if I have occasionally had a plastic handle brush, and it feels like my hand's sweating.
Yeah.
Whereas when I'm using wood, it feels as if it's breathing. If you
natural
like.
materials as much as we can.
Yeah.
But as I say, it's a changing world, and never say never. But we've seen plastic handled brushes in the education sector, and they're pretty dreadful. Really.
It's going to put those young kids off art for years, isn't it?
Maybe so.
Most of your brushes are, or the handles are kind of the straight, maybe with a slight curve in, but you do some other styles of handles. Some I've seen, like a pen, like a square.
Yep.
So, what's the thinking behind the handle shape?
Well, much of the handle shape is just the feel in the hand. As you go down to a 10-0 brush, you can't give the handle much of a shaping. As you get onto a bigger watercolour brush, a big size 12 or a 16, it's got a lovely feel in the hand, and it's sort of shaped with a curve that will give you that nice sort of ergonomic feel. But more recently we came up with an idea for the miniature painter and model painter that they may want something that's that they can sort of grab hold of, and we created what we call a tri-grip handle brush, and that just gives the handle a little bit more of a feel and something to get hold of. Yeah,
I want to talk a little bit about. Now we've gone into quite some detail about what the brushes are made of. So I want to talk a little bit, if we can, about development. And your brushes are used for a wide range of things. So I've seen this some for cake decorating, obviously model makers, watercolour, oil artists, you name it, people are using the brushes. So how do you find out what each of those individual disciplines require from a brush, and how do you then bring that into production?
Well, we don't really. What we do, we focus on manufacturing quality products. There are so many crossovers with brushes. If we produce a size, well, whatever size, it doesn't matter. If a cake decorator can use that brush, great. If a model painter can utilise that brush, great. Wargamers, nail artists, you name it. Ceramic painters, glass paint. People use brushes for so many different things. So it's very difficult to pigeonhole certain products for certain things. As long as we produce that product to a high standard, then, you know, the idea is that it can be utilised by all these people.
Do you work with individual artists, or do artists come to you with ideas? You know, like you can, if you're a guitar player, you can buy an Eric Clapton signature Fender Stratocaster. You know, could you buy a Yorkshire Gamer branded paintbrush? You know, do you work with artists?
Yes, we do. There's quite a bit of that goes on. You know, we manufacture brushes with their name on. So it strengthens their name. We do a brand of brushes that we market for the mail order people, so we're able to. It's a bit like the supermarket own branding, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, it might be made by a big company, but we all know who it's made by.
Yeah.
But it's got Morrison's or Asda's name on it. You know, we have a range of brushes that we market for mail order companies where we can put their name on the handle.
Right.
But we do it for individual artists. We do it for all sorts of people. So we do sort of private label and own branding.
Yeah.
And we've done that for quite some time.
Yeah. It was one of the questions I was going to ask, actually, where, you know, is there a like an Asda cornflakes equivalent with Pro Arte? So you do that for other companies if they request.
We do. As long as the demand is there. We can't just be doing half a dozen brushes, you know, for a certain guy who wants fancies his name on.
Yeah.
You know, there are limitations because of you know, all the different print processes and so on and so forth. But we can personalise things if the demand is there.
And developments then in terms of new technology, how do you hear about that through your suppliers? I think you talked about earlier on with your brush suppliers about new materials to use, and then do you test them out when you hear about them?
Exactly, yeah, every now and again. As I say, the most important part is the hair supply. That's where you generally is the starting point of creating a new brush. So I may have a hair supplier that comes to me and says, right, we've got this new hair, can you use it? And we'll test it out and try it out, and hence things like Sabline and Bristline. So yeah, very much, it's very much an ongoing process. There is that scenario where if you're not careful, you can just produce brushes for the sake of it, and we try not to go down that route. We generally look at the scenario, and if there's a need or a requirement for either a new brush or a new style of brush, then we'll pursue it and put it into the marketplace. But we don't just create ranges of brushes for the sake of it. Otherwise, we'd have so many colour combinations, and you can go on forever, and there's no merit in that.
One of the nice things that Pro Arte do is that you produce sets of brushes as well as being able to buy them individually in shops. So you can go in and pick 4 or 5 brushes in a normally in like a plastic wallet. Was that something that you drove, or was that from customers? And what's the idea behind it?
It's probably something that's always been around to some degree, but it's a starting point for people. If they're not quite sure what to buy, then a brush set makes their mind up. It's a perfect opportunity. And usually when you buy a brush set, it comes with a saving. So if you buy them all individually, you'll pay a bit more than buying the brush set.
And this is Yorkshire after all, and we're all about saving money.
Well, everyone likes to save a bit of money. But we don't do sets for the sake of it. All our prestige lines ranges will carry a brush set that showcases that particular range. So we've got probably something like 15 different alternatives that mirror our best-selling product ranges. And then we've got what we call a back-to-school, back-to-college range, which are sort of budget products, which are very nice quality products, but they're targeted at students and beginners. So we sell a lot of the back-to-school ranges. And we've got a few craft sets and 1 or 2 of the sort of supermarket own brand style, where we can put the dealer's name on there, which gives the dealer a bit of kudos as well. So brush sets are very much an important part of our business.
Perfect. The plastic caps on the end, do you supply them? Or because sometimes you go into an art shop and there's like 5 brushes and one of them's got a cap on.
We don't. Yeah, well, we don't supply them. We put them on when we're manufacturing, or it's part of the finishing off process. When we've manufactured a brush, gummed it and pointed it and shaped it, we want to protect. It's really the round brushes, because it's the tip of the brush that you need to protect. So we put a clear brush protector on. Now, what happens when they get to the shops? Many retailers will take them off and usually store them somewhere. So if you're buying a brush and it doesn't have a brush protector on, ask the retailer if they've still got it and if it can be replaced.
It should be around.
What tends to happen is a customer might be browsing, they may take the cap off, and then they'll flick the brush, have a look at it, test it out, and then decide that isn't necessarily the brush that they want to buy.
Yeah.
So in endeavour to replace the cap, they shove the cap down onto the bristles or the fibres, and it does so much damage, then it can create some real problems. So yeah, this is why much of the time dealers will actually remove the caps. So it doesn't damage the brushes.
But as far as you're concerned, Peter, they're leaving here with a cap on.
Absolutely.
And they're right when they leave here.
They're right when they leave here. That's what it's all about.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
It's very confusing or can be very confusing for somebody new to painting in whatever style. So what would you say to somebody who's coming along and looking? I mean, there's a big show stand in front of me here with all the different paintbrushes on. Is there any advice you would give to somebody to say, try this one first and then kind of move on from there?
Well, but people, when they're starting, they generally have an idea which medium that they want to paint in.
Yeah.
Acrylic nowadays tends to be a very, very popular one. But as I've said before, acrylic can encompass a big range. You can thin it right down to thin watercolour, or you can use it heavy impasto. So I tend to sort of look at it. There's two main styles of painting. That's your oil colour, your oil painting, where you're using thick, heavy paint, or you're using a sort of watercolour brush for either watercolour painting or inks or thin down acrylic paints. So people generally would know what they want. Now, if they're faced with one of our big brush units, then we've got labelling on there that will tell them. It will tell them whether it's an oil brush or a watercolour brush. And the rule of thumb is a watercolour brush uses a much softer fibre than an oil brush. So you generally can't go far wrong. And the nice thing is, dealing with small or independent art shops, where most of our brushes are sold, there is a retailer knowledge. Most art shop owners will make sure that their staff are fully versed and fully understand the products available. So never worry, just ask for a bit of advice if you're not sure. But there is information on the displays.
I think that's really good advice, actually, to actually ask people.
Absolutely.
Because from my experience, years and years of going into art shops, the people in there are generally lovely people who are artists themselves, and they will give you a pointer on the type of brush and all the things that we've spoken about today, about the different materials, the different shapes of the brushes, what they do. They will give you the advice on all that. So
absolutely. And if in doubt, at the end of the day, we've always got a website.
Exactly.
We keep it fairly simple, fairly straightforward, but there's drop-down lists that give all the watercolour ranges, give all the different oil acrylic ranges, and then there's the hair types. So it's got various filters. So if you're searching for a particular brush, you should be able to navigate your way through.
Brilliant. We're just coming towards the end now, but there's one thing that I want to talk about before we finish off, and that's this sounds like a really bad documentary on Discovery Channel. When brushes go wrong. So,
this is the worst bit.
This is the worst bit. Yeah. So,
no one ever likes to blame themselves. No, that's what happens.
Yeah, so
go on.
Just from your kind of knowledge then and experience, the things that tend to go wrong with brushes, from what people have told me and from my own experience, is that you will get to a stage where you lose the point.
Yeah.
So how does that come about? What's the good way to try and stop it?
I'm not sure there is a good way to try and stop it, because when you use any product, then a brush, you're wearing it out. More often than not, a brush that has lost its point is worn out. Now, the smaller the brush, the faster that's going to wear out, because there's less resistance because you've got a much smaller amount of fibre there. There are various mitigating factors that will cause a brush to wear out. If you're painting on a coarse surface, that's going to make a brush wear out faster. If you're painting with not a lot of fluid in the brush, a dry brush technique, that's going to make a brush wear out much quicker. Some people adopt a sort of scrubbing technique.
Yeah.
that can make a brush wear out. So don't ever buy a brush thinking it's going to last forever, because it won't.
No.
Now, depending on the way that you look after it, you can lengthen its life. But it is very much down to how you use a brush, how often you use a brush, how many hours a day you're using that brush. There are so many variables that, often it's just simply questions that I cannot answer.
Sometimes you'll get a brush where the tip curls. Is there any reason for that? Is that just use?
Again, much of it will be use, wear and tear. What tends to happen with a synthetic brush as opposed to a sable brush? Sable is a much softer material. So you'll lose that point quite quickly on a sable brush. I remember back as a youngster, while the graphic industry was still vibrant, we used to send a lot of sable brushes out. Our 2A sable, it's a long elongated point, because a graphic designer would want a brush to carry colour but with a very, very long, sharp, steeple-shaped point. And they'd use a brush maybe for half an hour or an hour and bin it, because they'd worn the point out, because they're using this very, very fine point. But so sable tends to wear out, whereas synthetics wear out of shape. What tends to happen is you're using a synthetic brush, you're thinning the tip of the brush. But because it's a much harder fibre than sable, instead of it actually wearing away, it wears out of shape.
Right.
And often that can be the reason for a hook or at the end of the tip. Now, in its infancy, you can actually restore that tip by dipping it in very, very hot or even boiling water. And that can also resolve certain problems with synthetic brushes, where if you've left them in the drawer and the tip's got damaged, or someone's replaced a protective cap and it's kinked all the fibres back, then it's like magic. You can put it in hot water and it brings it back to a very, very sharp point.
Oh, right.
But when a brush is excessively worn, that technique won't necessarily resolve the problem, because it's all down to natural wear and tear.
Are there any good tips for, most of the people listening to this will be using acrylic paint, is there any good tips for cleaning brushes?
Well, most of the time when people come to me and say, I've got a problem with my brush, the first question I ask them is, are you using acrylic paint? I don't say what sort of paint are you using. I say, I bet your life you're using acrylic paint. And more often than not, they'll say, yes, I am.
Yeah.
And that's because acrylic paint dries so quickly, which is great if you want it to dry on the product that you're painting. The only drawback is, while it's drying on the brush, it's causing the brush a problem, because it dries. Particularly in the ferrule, pigment builds up in the base of the fibre, and it causes the brush to split. So when you're using a brush, particularly with acrylic paint, is make sure the brush is always kept wet. Probably the tip ideally immersed in water. You can buy certain it's like a cleaning product, a cleaning.
Is it brush soap?
No, you might have to edit this. I'm just trying to think what they call it. It's like a container that you can put your brush in, so the brush head is immersed in water.
Okay, yeah.
So that helps. But basically, what tends to happen is, as I say, because it dries a lot faster, once acrylic paint actually sets, you can't unset it.
Yeah.
So it damages the brush forever. But more often than not, when people come to me with a problem, it's because a lot of it is down to cleaning. Pigment builds up in the base of the ferrule. and it stops the brush from pointing. It makes the brush, it seems to build a pressure up in the bottom, and the brush fibres start to split. So cleaning, not just at the end of use, probably cleaning during use is good. Keep washing the brushes out as much as possible, but particularly at the end, one of the most important things, and it's harder on a very, very tiny brush, is to basically get hold of a brush, get hold of the fibre, and actually knead the pigment out of the base of the ferrule.
Yeah.
So if it's a substantial brush, you can get hold of the fibre much easier than a 10-0 brush. So usually with the tiny brushes, you've just got to sort of wash away in the water. But it's basically one of the main causes of a brush causing problems is build-up of pigment in the base of the ferrule.
Yeah, that's certainly the problem that I've come across most over the years when I've had problems with brushes. What's your views on brush soap then? Some people think it's a waste of time, some people use it religiously.
Well, I hear some very good reports. There is one out there called Masters Brush Soap.
Yeah.
I think it's an American product, and everybody seems to swear by it.
Yeah, I use that. It's amazing stuff.
Yeah,
it really is good.
So if it prolongs the length of the life of a brush, I think it possibly, as well as cleaning, it possesses something that maybe gives the brush a bit of a coating, maybe a bit like a fabric conditioner or something like that. So, I've heard reports that it just gives it a nicer feel, probably a silkier, softer feel than, or it puts a bit of life back into it. Yeah, I've nothing against that at all.
I'm a big fan of it, I have to say.
Yeah.
So final question then. Thank you very much we've been going for an hour and a half, so thank you very much for your time. And it's just really what's the future for Pro Arte? What are we looking at in the future for the company?
Well, who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows? Things, as my father used to say, nothing lasts forever. Things are always changing. As far as I'm concerned, we're doing well as a business. We keep plugging away, and it's important to keep a focus and to remain where we are. We're specialists.
Yeah.
That was our original intention, not to get bogged down with other products, to stick with brushes, to specialise and to do a job properly.
Yeah.
And if we can continue to do that, then I'll be a happy man.
Yeah. If you're leading in the area of business, don't muck about with other stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's just not worth
It's always been our ethos. Stick with what we know.
Yeah.
We haven't got real sort of feelings of grandeur as such. As long as we're giving people good product at good price, then that's what it's all about.
Lovely.
Yeah.
So, that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate you taking the time talking to me today. And at the end of the show, I'll just say good night to all my listeners. So if you could say good night.
Good night, everybody. Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
So there we go. That's paintbrushes. We now are all experts in paintbrushes, and we all know that we need to buy them from Pro Arte. So available at all your local art shops. Keep an eye out for them. They really are. They have been my go-to brush since I was in my late teens, and I am now 55. And I've dipped in and tried other things, but for the price, they are, for me, the best value around. And I've been looking to do this interview for a long time, and I'm so glad that I've got it done. And I'm just kind of pushing the boundaries, pushing those envelopes a little bit with some of the subject matter that I cover that maybe you're not hearing on other podcasts. I want to try and get as much different content as I possibly can. So thank you, Peter, and hopefully you'll see a big spike in your sales as a result of this. So that just means I've got to mention very briefly the next episode 49, and I'm going to be speaking with one of the big rule writers in the hobby, and that's Dave Brown. Dave's got many different rule sets out. He's got a long history of writing stuff for the larger size game, so he's a perfect guest for this show. And I think his general d'arme Arte 2 rules are out soon, so I'm sure we'll catch up with him about that and many other things. Does he like avocado? Tune in a couple of weeks' time and we'll find out. Until then, Sithy!